Welcome back. Well, criticism of Guantanamo Bay has been intense, and it comes amidst a growing chorus for the prison to be closed. Critics have slammed Guantanamo Bay, claiming the prisoners' detention is cruel and unusual. Prisoners are confined in their cells 23 hours a day with little exercise. Lights are kept on day and night. As well, human rights organizations and released detainees have accused the U.S. of torture. This has included sleep deprivation, beatings and druggings during interrogation. Moreover, many are believed to be innocent. Around 340 have been released from Guantanamo without charge or any form of compensation for the years they were detained. Well, we're still joined by our guests in London, Asim Qureshi from Cage Prisoners, an organisation campaigning for repatriation or asylum for Guantanamo detainees. In Washington, Amr Hamzawi, Senior Associate and Political Scientist at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Unfortunately, we've lost our Republican strategist, Jack Berkman. If I could start with Amr Hamzawi, what will happen to those many inmates that don't want to be returned to their home countries for fear for their safety or lives?
So far, we have been seeing two policies practiced by the U.S. authorities. Some of the detainees have been sent in the last 24 months to their home countries, in spite of the fact that their home countries are human rights violators. Countries, governments with bad records with regard to human rights, countries that have been torturing political prisoners over decades. And these are primarily Middle Eastern Arab countries: Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, Algeria. The second policy which we have been seeing is the U.S. government sending detainees to countries where they never resided before, not to their home countries, but countries where we have governments that are friendly with the U.S. administration, and where these detainees can be managed in a safe manner from a security perspective, like Albania in Eastern Europe, or in the Balkans and other Eastern European countries. And in fact, these two policies are quite frightening and morally very questionable. And let's not forget that Guantanamo is itself, the practice of the U.S. administration in Guantanamo, are heavily under attack. Here in the U.S., there are clear public opinion attitudes that are pressing the Bush administration to consider closing it down. And I'm afraid instead of taking a bold step in the right direction, the U.S. administration is once again backtracking in a different way by sending these detainees to countries where they can be tortured, or where they do not live the decent lives they really have earned, especially after what happened to them in the last 4 or 5 years.
All right, that's an interesting term you used there, the wrong step in the right direction. Let's bring Asim Qureshi back into the discussion from London. What is it? Is there anything that they can do to challenge where they are sent back? And particularly in cases where we've heard, for example, about Uyghur Chinese being settled in Albania.
No, there isn't much they can do, and I think the Uyghurs provide the perfect example. Obviously, the Americans were not going to send them back to China. So instead, what they did is that they asked a number of countries, would you like to take these individuals? And Albania, of course, looking for entry into the EU, put up its hand and said, yes, you know, we promote human rights. We're very much involved with human rights. We'll take them off your hands. Only problem is, of course, is that none of the Uyghurs speak the Albanian language, nor know any of the Albanian customs, nor know any English or French or any other language, international language, that might get them through living in such a country. They literally sit there right now, unable to converse with anyone other than themselves, and literally now imprisoned within a country where they can't interact with anybody. So it's another form of imprisonment. It's a ridiculous step for them to have taken, and these poor Uyghurs are now paying the price for having done absolutely nothing.
All right, as for those who are sent back to countries where they're not in fear of their safety and lives, can they sue? Some of them claim that they've been tortured, they've lost eyes and limbs. Can they take any legal action for that?
Well, theoretically, they should be allowed to, but the American administration has worked very hard to make sure that nobody can bring any kind of claims against them. I do believe that there are some claims at the moment that are being lodged for compensation, but I would doubt the extent to which that it will be possible.
All right, perhaps while we're talking about those who are returned and where they're going, we should also remember that some of them are going through the military-style tribunal process that's going on. I just want to read a quote here by Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Abraham, who was an Army reservist and lawyer. He spent 6 months between 2004 and 2005 as a panelist on the so-called combatant status review tribunals that are looking into the cases of some of those held at Guantanamo Bay. And what he said was what were purported to be specific statements of fact lacked even the most fundamental earmarks of objectively credible evidence. Now, Amr Hamzawi in Washington, what is happening to people who are going through that sort of tribunal process?
Well, it's quite a frustrating practice. In fact, when you look at it, be it from a moral or from a legalistic perspective, they are deprived from basic rights, which prisoners, detainees will have in normal court procedures, and they do not have them. The second issue is that we really do not know what is happening. There is no public scrutiny. These issues are highly held away from public scrutiny, be it from the press or from public debates here in the US or elsewhere. And once again, we are faced with practices that do not belong to a state where the rule of law is established. And this has been the US for a long time. I'm afraid the Bush administration has managed in the last years to deliberalize this country. Their practices are casting a lot of doubts about the validity of rule of law. They are creating enclaves where the rule of law is no longer relevant. And with all this, you have a bundle of practices, be it sending them back to governments that are human rights violators, or to countries where they do not belong and do not live as they expect, or torturing them and subjecting them to practices that are no longer expected from democratic government. So it's quite a frustrating issue, and I'm not sure whether we will move ahead in the coming 2 years until this administration leaves the White House.
All right. Asim in London, for those who are considered guilty, who are found by this tribunal process, however right or wrong it is, as Amr was questioning there, but for those who are considered guilty of having done something wrong, what is the long-term plan for them? They're going to go to jail? Are they going to be executed? What is the plan for them?
Well, I think they're going to be held in Guantanamo for quite a long period of time. Whether or not they're ever going to actually see a US courtroom is a completely different matter. Remember that a lot of the evidence that was extracted from these individuals, people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shib, and others considered to be high-value Al-Qaeda members, they were subjected to treatment such as waterboarding. So when you start taking that kind of evidence into a normal US courtroom, then of course the evidence becomes tainted and comes under all of the different rules that are internationally accepted. In Guantanamo, though, the US can get away with whatever it wants because it's changed the rules, because it allows for a lower standard of evidence to be used. Not even evidence, we should say. They allow for circumstantial evidence, for hearsay, for evidence coerced by torture to be used. So when you have a system like that in Guantanamo, it's a lot easier for them to then get away with whatever they want and get whatever kind of verdict they like.
All right, well, Amr Hamzawi in Washington, as listening to some of the State Department comments, it does seem like the US is keen now to try and close the Guantanamo Bay chapter. How easy will it be to close that chapter, and what will be its perhaps lasting legacy on other US administrations and on relations between US and some of its allies?
I guess this administration, until it leaves the White House, will simply try to move ahead at the two levels we indicated earlier. One, to send detainees back to their home countries where we have US-friendly governments, or to send them to third countries where they can be managed from a security perspective. They will not close down Guantanamo in spite of the mounting public pressures here in the US. And this is basically the legacy of this administration. This administration has done too little to correct its policy failures, to correct different deficiencies that were clear in the last years, be it with regard to Iraq or the Middle East in general or Guantanamo. They are just holding still until they leave, and then a new administration, be it Republican or Democratic, will be faced with a clear choice, whether this should continue or whether a return back to the real liberal traditions of this country will be put forward by a Democratic or a Republican administration.
And what do you think will happen?
Well, it really depends. I'm listening to presidential candidates, to presidential hopefuls. In the Republican field, I would be quite inclined to say that maybe we will still have a few more years to come with Guantanamo under a new Republican administration. Listening to Democratic candidates, it is clear that there is a growing consensus in the Democratic field that the U.S. should do away with this bad legacy of the last years of the Bush administration, as they are trying to figure out ways to get out of Iraq or to get the U.S. out of the trap of the Middle East in which the Bush administration has maneuvered American interests and America in general into by invading Iraq.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave the discussion there and thank our guests in Washington, Amr Hamzawi from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and in London, Asim Qureshi from Cage Prisoners. I'd also like to thank our Republican strategist, Jack Berkman, who unfortunately couldn't be with us in the second half of this show. And thank you, the viewer, so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.